The black SUV rolled up the gravel drive just after 7 in the morning, kicking up a thin cloud of dust that hung in the summer air like a warning. 3 lawyers climbed out first, their suits pressed too sharp for a residential street, followed by 2 security men in dark polos who stood with their arms crossed, as if guarding a courtroom rather than a quiet lane of houses. Victoria Hayes stepped out last, sunglasses already on despite the early hour, a leather folder clutched against her chest, like a weapon she had been waiting years to use. She walked up the porch steps of the old ranch house without an invitation, without a knock, and dropped a thick stack of papers onto the weathered wood in front of Ethan Carter, who had been sitting there with his coffee since dawn. "You have exactly 24 hours to tear down this entire property," she said, her voice pitched loud enough for the neighbors gathering at the edge of their lawns to hear every word. Several of them already had their phones raised, capturing the moment the way people capture a car accident, unable to look away. Ethan set his mug down slowly on the porch rail. He looked at the papers for a few seconds, not long enough to read them, long enough only to recognize the letterhead of the Homeowners Association that had been harassing him for the better part of 2 years. Then he looked up at Victoria, and instead of the panic she expected, instead of the pleading she had rehearsed a response for, he simply smiled. "Okay," he said. That single word landed strangely in the morning air, too calm, too easy, and it made Victoria's confident expression flicker for just a moment before she recovered it. She turned on her heel, gathered her lawyers with a flick of her wrist, and marched back to the SUV, as if she had just won a war that had barely begun. What none of the onlookers understood, what none of the phones recording that morning could have captured, was that while Victoria was celebrating in her car on the drive home, Ethan was already dialing a number that would change everything. By the following afternoon, a contract would be signed that made him the legal owner of the very clubhouse where the Homeowners Association held every one of its meetings. And by the next morning, the rent on that building would rise tenfold. The ranch itself had stood on that land for more than 40 years, long before the gated community with its manicured lawns and matching mailboxes had ever been imagined by a developer with a taste for profit. Ethan Carter had inherited it from his father, a stretch of land wide enough to keep a handful of horses, a workshop where he restored old tractors on weekends, and a wraparound porch where he took his coffee every morning regardless of the weather. He was 42 years old, quiet by nature, the kind of man who wore the same faded denim jacket to town meetings that he wore to muck out stalls, and most of his neighbors assumed he was simply a rancher scraping by on family land. Few of them knew that Ethan managed a private family trust worth considerably more than every house in the new development combined, or that he had spent 15 years quietly acquiring commercial real estate across 3 counties. He never advertised it, never wore it, and never once used it to intimidate anyone, which was precisely why so many people underestimated him. The trouble began 3 years earlier, when a developer flattened the pasture land just east of Ethan's property and built 42 identical houses behind an iron gate, each one advertised as luxury living for families seeking exclusivity. A homeowners association formed almost immediately, and Victoria Hayes, a woman who had made her fortune in commercial leasing, before retiring into a life of committee meetings and monogrammed stationery, was elected president within the first year. She was 48, sharp-featured, and utterly convinced that control was a form of care, that rules existed to protect property values, and that anyone who refused to fall in line with her vision was an active threat to everyone around them. From the very first month, she regarded Ethan's ranch as an eyesore sitting at the edge of her kingdom, a wound in the landscape that lowered the resale value of every home she had helped sell. The letters began soon after. First, it was a demand that Ethan repaint his fence to match the community's approved color palette, a shade of gray, so specific it required a special order from a supplier 3 towns over. Then came a notice banning horses within view of the main road, followed by another prohibiting any structure resembling a barn or stable, as though the presence of livestock might somehow infect the property values of families 200 yards away. When Ethan continued to park his pickup truck in his own driveway, he received a citation claiming that commercial vehicles were not permitted on residential streets, despite the truck being registered to him personally and used for nothing but hauling feed. Each time, Ethan responded the same way, politely, in writing, citing the deed restrictions that predated the Homeowners Association by decades, and made clear his property was never bound by its rules in the first place. He never raised his voice in the community meetings he occasionally attended, never filed a countersuit, never gave Victoria the satisfaction of a public argument, and that composure infuriated her more than any confrontation could have. Victoria had grown accustomed to a very particular kind of power over the years, the sort that came not from wealth alone but from the quiet fear she could instill in people who simply wanted to avoid conflict in their own neighborhood. She had learned early on that most residents would rather pay an unfair fine than spend the energy contesting it, that most families moving into a new development wanted harmony more than they wanted justice, and that a woman willing to escalate every disagreement into a formal complaint would eventually be given whatever she asked for, simply because nobody else had the stomach for a prolonged fight. She used that leverage on smaller disputes long before she ever turned her attention fully toward Ethan, forcing one family to remove a basketball hoop because it was visible from the street, forcing another to replace perfectly functional shutters because the color had faded 2 shades from the approved palette. Each small victory reinforced her sense that the rules existed less as guidelines and more as instruments she alone was entitled to wield. And by the time she set her sights on the ranch, she had convinced herself she was untouchable within the boundaries of her own community. What made Ethan different, though she never allowed herself to consider it seriously, was that he had never once needed anything from her association. He did not care whether his property value climbed alongside the new houses around him, did not attend committee dinners hoping to be seen as agreeable, did not fear the kind of social exile that kept so many of his neighbors compliant. His refusal to engage with her threats on her terms read to Victoria not as independence but as arrogance, a kind of quiet defiance she found more insulting than any direct argument could have been. She began mentioning him by name at board meetings months before the 24-hour ultimatum, using his ranch as an example whenever she wanted to justify tightening some new restriction, painting him as the sort of resident who made the entire community look unkempt simply by existing on its edge. By the 3rd year, Victoria had convinced herself that the only obstacle standing between her association and total uniformity was one stubborn rancher who refused to be intimidated by paperwork. She began meeting privately with her board, then with outside lawyers, searching for any legal angle that might force Ethan off land his family had owned since before her development existed. When her attorneys finally handed her a document claiming a zoning technicality that could, in theory, classify the ranch as a code violation requiring demolition, she did not wait for a judge to review it. She printed the notice, gathered her entourage, and delivered it herself on a Tuesday morning, certain that the sight of lawyers and security guards would be enough to break a man who had spent his whole life quietly working land with his own 2 hands. That evening, back inside the clubhouse that served as the association's headquarters, Victoria called an emergency meeting of the full board. The room was packed, nearly every member of the association crowded into folding chairs beneath the crystal chandelier she had insisted on installing the year before, and when she stood at the podium to describe the morning's confrontation, the room erupted into applause before she had even finished the sentence. "He will be gone within the week," she told them, her voice carrying the particular satisfaction of someone who believed victory was already secured. Several board members nodded along, already discussing what might be built on the land once the ranch was cleared, floating ideas for a second pool, a dog park, perhaps an expanded parking structure for guests. Nobody in that room asked whether the notice would actually hold up in court, because nobody in that room had ever needed to ask that question before. Every previous target of the association's pressure campaigns had folded quickly, unable to afford the legal fees required to fight back, and Victoria saw no reason to believe Ethan Carter would be any different. What none of them understood was how thoroughly the association had built its authority on assumptions rather than facts. Over the years, Victoria had expanded the board's reach far beyond what its founding documents actually permitted, levying fines for violations that were never clearly defined, hiring contractors who happened to be her personal friends, and quietly steering maintenance contracts toward companies that returned the favor in other ways. Dues had crept upward every year under the justification of rising costs, even as several residents began to notice that common areas looked increasingly neglected despite the growing budget. Nobody had pushed back hard enough to expose any of it, because Victoria had a talent for making disagreement feel like disloyalty, framing every objection as an attack on the community's shared values rather than a reasonable question about where the money was going. The board she had assembled around her was less a governing body than an audience, applauding whatever she proposed and rarely asking why. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in his kitchen that same evening, with the phone pressed to his ear, speaking to a woman named Rachel Morgan, a real estate attorney he had worked with for nearly a decade and trusted more than almost anyone outside his own family. He read the notice aloud to her, line by line, and she listened without interrupting, the way she always did when something struck her as more interesting than alarming. When he finished, there was a pause on the line long enough that he asked if she was still there. "I'm here," she said. "I'm just thinking that this association has been operating on borrowed confidence for a very long time, and borrowed confidence tends to collapse the moment someone actually checks the paperwork." She told him she would look into the clubhouse's ownership records first thing in the morning, a request that struck Ethan as strange until she explained her reasoning. "Every association needs a headquarters," she said, a physical space to hold its meetings and project its authority, and very few residents ever stop to ask who actually owns the building, where all of that authority is performed. "I think," she said slowly, "you should consider buying the problem instead of fighting it." Ethan did not fully understand what she meant. Not yet, but something in her tone told him it was worth waiting to find out. Rachel spent the following 2 days doing what she did best, pulling property records, tracing deeds, and cross-referencing filings that most people never bothered to read past the first page. What she uncovered surprised even her. The clubhouse that served as the beating heart of the Homeowners Association, the building where every fine was announced and every vote was cast, did not belong to the association at all. It belonged to a man named Howard Blake, 65 years old, who had constructed the building himself, back when the land was first developed, and had simply leased it to the association, under a long-term agreement, rather than selling it outright. The lease, buried in language nobody on the board had apparently ever bothered to review closely, contained a clause allowing the rent to be renegotiated at the landlord's discretion in the event of a change in ownership. Victoria and her board had been operating for years under the assumption that the clubhouse was association property, never once questioning the arrangement because the rent had remained comfortably low since the very beginning. Rachel dug further and discovered something even more useful. Howard Blake was, by every indication, thoroughly exhausted by his relationship with the association. Late payments had become routine over the past 2 years, the board citing budget shortfalls that never seemed to improve despite dues increasing annually. Damage to the property went unreported and unrepaired for months at a time, water stains spreading across the ceiling near the kitchen, a section of the parking lot cracking wider each season without anyone from the board authorizing the repair. Howard had mentioned to a mutual acquaintance, almost in passing, that he had considered selling the building outright more than once, but assumed no buyer would want to inherit a tenant as difficult as Victoria's board. Rachel arranged a private meeting between Howard and Ethan for that same week, telling neither of them very much in advance, wanting the two men to speak plainly and see for themselves whether the pieces might fit together. The meeting took place at a small diner 2 towns over, far enough from the development that nobody was likely to recognize either of them. Howard arrived first, a tired-looking man with sun-worn hands and the particular weariness of someone who had built something with pride only to watch it slowly become a burden. When Ethan sat down across from him, Howard didn't waste time with small talk. He described almost apologetically how the association had treated him over the years, how Victoria had once implied during a lease negotiation that he should simply be grateful the building was occupied at all, how the board seemed to believe the clubhouse would remain theirs on their terms forever, regardless of what the lease actually said. "They think I'll never sell," Howard said, stirring his coffee without drinking it. "They think nobody would want the headache." Ethan asked him a single question in response. What would it take to change his mind? Howard named a number that was, if anything, modest for the size and location of the building, and Ethan agreed to it without a single word of negotiation, sliding a folder across the table that Rachel had already prepared with every document needed to close the sale within days. Before any of that, Howard spent several minutes simply talking, the way people do when a long-held frustration finally finds a willing listener. He explained how he had built the clubhouse himself back when the development first broke ground, hiring the crew personally, choosing the fixtures, taking a quiet pride in a building that had, for a while, felt like his own small legacy sitting at the center of a growing neighborhood. He described how the early years of the lease had gone smoothly enough, the association paying on time, minor repairs handled without complaint, a working relationship that felt more like partnership than obligation. But something had shifted, he said, somewhere around the time Victoria took over the board, when polite requests turned into demands and modest complaints turned into accusations that Howard was failing to maintain a property he no longer had the funds to properly repair because the rent had never once kept pace with actual costs. He mentioned, almost bitterly, a phone call from Victoria the previous winter in which she had told him, quite plainly, that he should consider himself fortunate. The association hadn't simply found another building to lease instead, as though loyalty to a tenant who paid late and complained often was somehow the greater gift being extended. Ethan listened without interrupting, the same patient stillness he brought to every conversation, and when Howard finally trailed off, he asked only how long the man had been waiting for someone to finally take the building off his hands. Howard laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it, and admitted he had assumed nobody would ever want it, not with a tenant as difficult as Victoria's board attached to the deal. Ethan told him the difficulty was, in fact, the entire reason he wanted it. Howard stared at the folder for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to a buyer who didn't try to talk him down. He asked Ethan why he wanted the building so badly, and Ethan gave him an honest answer rather than a clever one. Because the people who run that association think property is a weapon, he said. I'd rather own the weapon than keep dodging it. Howard laughed for the first time since sitting down, a short, surprised sound, and signed the paperwork before he could talk himself out of it. The transaction moved quickly and quietly through Rachel's office, recorded through a holding entity that gave no immediate indication of who stood behind it, and within 72 hours, the deed to the clubhouse belonged entirely to Ethan Carter. Neither Howard nor Ethan told a single person outside the small circle involved, and Victoria, still riding high on the confidence of her 24-hour ultimatum, had no idea that the ground beneath her association's authority had already shifted. While the sale was finalizing, Victoria was busy hosting what could only be described as a celebration. She invited several board members to her home the evening before the demolition deadline, opened a bottle of champagne she had apparently been saving for the occasion, and toasted to what she called the end of an embarrassment. By tomorrow afternoon, she told her guests, raising her glass toward the window that faced the direction of Ethan's ranch, this neighborhood will finally look the way it was always supposed to look. Nobody at that gathering questioned whether the demolition notice would actually hold up to legal scrutiny, because nobody in that room had any experience with what a properly prepared defense could do to an improperly prepared attack. They spoke about landscaping plans for the cleared land, about how much smoother board meetings would run once the last holdout was gone, about how satisfying it would feel to finally have full control over every inch of the community. Victoria went to bed that night, more certain of her victory than she had been of anything in years. The morning of the deadline arrived with a kind of theater that only Victoria could have orchestrated. She brought her 3 lawyers again, along with an excavator idling on a flatbed truck, and 2 uniformed contractors standing by with clipboards, as though the visual spectacle alone might be enough to intimidate Ethan into compliance before a single legal argument was even exchanged. Neighbors gathered again along the road, some out of curiosity, some hoping to see the standoff resolved once and for all. Phones raised just as they had been the first morning. Victoria stepped out of her car with the same confidence she had carried a day earlier, walking toward the porch where Ethan stood waiting, calm as ever, a folder of his own tucked under his arm. I hope you've made arrangements to move your animals, she said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Because this property is coming down today, whether you like it or not. The excavator's engine idled in the background the entire time, a low mechanical growl that seemed to underscore every word exchanged on that porch, as if the machine itself were impatient to begin tearing into land it had no legal right to touch. One of the contractors kept glancing nervously between Victoria and the crowd, clearly unaccustomed to the volume of attention a routine demolition notice had somehow attracted, while the other simply checked his phone, unaware that the morning was about to unfold into something far outside the scope of his clipboard. A few residents near the front of the gathered crowd exchanged uneasy glances, sensing, perhaps for the first time, that the confidence Victoria projected each time she confronted Ethan had never actually been tested against anything more substantial than his silence. That was the moment Rachel stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly near the fence line, dressed simply, carrying nothing more dramatic than a manila folder of her own. She introduced herself to Victoria's lawyers with a politeness that made the confrontation feel almost anticlimactic, and then began walking them through the documents inside her folder, page by page, in front of everyone gathered. She explained, calmly and without a hint of theater, that the zoning technicality cited in the demolition notice had been misapplied, that the deed restrictions on Ethan's property predated the association's authority entirely, and that no enforcement action of this scale could proceed without a court order that the association had never actually sought. One of Victoria's own lawyers, visibly uncomfortable, admitted under Rachel's questioning that the notice had been drafted hastily and had not, in fact, been reviewed by outside counsel before delivery. Victoria's face shifted from confidence to disbelief as she realized her own legal team was unraveling the foundation she had built her entire morning around. She was still trying to regain her composure, still insisting that the demolition would proceed regardless of any paperwork technicality, when a second car pulled up along the road and Howard Blake stepped out, moving slower than the others but with a clear sense of purpose. He walked past the excavator, past the lawyers, past Victoria herself, and stopped only when he reached the small gathering near the porch. I should mention something, he said, addressing the crowd rather than any single person. I sold the clubhouse 3 days ago. The words landed in the quiet morning air, with a weight that seemed to physically alter the posture of everyone standing there. Victoria turned toward him so fast she nearly lost her sunglasses, demanding to know what he meant, insisting that the clubhouse was association property and had been for years. Howard shook his head slowly, almost sadly, and told her that the building had never belonged to anyone but him, that the association had only ever leased it, and that the lease itself now belonged to whoever had purchased the property beneath it. Victoria's voice climbed several octaves as she asked who exactly had bought it, spinning to look at the crowd as though the buyer might be hiding among the neighbors with their phones. Howard simply pointed toward the porch, toward the man who had spent the last 2 mornings being handed ultimatums by the very organization that was about to discover it no longer had a home. Him, Howard said. Ethan Carter owns your clubhouse now. For a long moment, nobody moved. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera kept recording, capturing the exact second Victoria's face drained of every ounce of certainty it had carried since the first ultimatum. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh, waving her hand as though brushing away an obviously ridiculous joke, insisting that a rancher with muddy boots could not possibly be the owner of a commercial property worth what that building was worth. Rachel, still holding her folder, stepped forward one more time and produced a certified copy of the deed, freshly recorded, stamped with the county's official seal, and dated 3 days earlier. She handed it to one of Victoria's own lawyers, who examined it in silence for a long, uncomfortable stretch, before confirming quietly that the document appeared entirely legitimate. Victoria snatched it from his hands and stared at the page as though sheer force of will might change what was written there, but the seal remained the seal, the signature remained the signature, and the name on the ownership line remained the same name that had, until that morning, meant nothing more to her than a stubborn neighbor she intended to erase from her development. The crowd along the road had gone almost entirely silent, the earlier excitement replaced by something closer to disbelief, as they watched the balance of power shift in real time. Ethan finally spoke, his voice as level as it had been the first morning Victoria had dropped her papers on his porch. "You gave me 24 hours to leave my home," he said, "so I used those 24 hours to buy yours." He wasn't shouting, wasn't gloating in any way that matched the theatrical energy Victoria had brought to both confrontations, and that quiet delivery seemed to unsettle her more than any raised voice could have. She demanded to know what he intended to do with the building, whether he planned to shut down the association entirely out of spite, whether this was simply revenge dressed up as a business transaction. Ethan told her, simply, that he had no plans to shut anything down. He only had plans to adjust the terms under which the association would be allowed to continue using a building that had never belonged to them in the first place. Within a week, every board member and every resident who paid attention to association matters received a formal notice on Ethan's letterhead. The new landlord, it explained, would be increasing the monthly rent on the clubhouse building by a factor of 10, effective in 30 days, in line with fair market value for a commercial property of its size and location. Residents who had grown accustomed to a below-market rate negotiated years earlier under far friendlier terms were suddenly staring at a number that would strain the association's already stretched budget far beyond its limits. The notice went on to explain, in the same calm and procedurally correct language Ethan had used in every letter he'd ever sent to the board, that should the new terms prove unacceptable, the association was welcome to vacate the premises within the specified notice period, at which point Ethan would be free to lease the space to any other tenant of his choosing. Victoria's first instinct was to fight the increase in court, certain that some judge somewhere would see the number as unreasonable, as retaliatory, as an obvious act of spite dressed up in legal language. She hired yet another attorney, a specialist this time in commercial leasing disputes, and demanded he find some angle that would invalidate the new terms before the 30 days expired. The attorney reviewed the original lease for the better part of 2 days before delivering the verdict Victoria least wanted to hear. The clause allowing rent renegotiation upon a change in ownership was airtight, drafted decades earlier by Howard's own lawyer with language broad enough to survive exactly the kind of challenge Victoria was hoping to bring. There was no cap on the increase, no requirement of board approval from the new owner, nothing that a court could reasonably interpret as a violation of the agreement both parties had signed in good faith. The attorney told her plainly that pursuing a lawsuit would likely cost more in legal fees than simply paying the new rent for a full year, and that the odds of winning were, in his professional opinion, close to non-existent. The financial strain that followed exposed cracks in the association that had been quietly forming for years, cracks that Victoria's confident leadership style had always managed to paper over before anyone looked too closely. With the clubhouse rent suddenly consuming a dramatically larger share of the annual budget, the board was forced to review its finances in detail for the first time in recent memory, and what several members found there did not sit well with anyone. Contracts with landscaping and maintenance companies turned out to have been awarded, year after year, to businesses with personal connections to Victoria, often at rates noticeably higher than competing bids the board had never bothered to request. Dues increases that had been justified by rising costs did not appear to correspond to any actual improvement in the community's shared spaces, several of which had visibly deteriorated despite the growing budget. A handful of residents who had quietly wondered about these discrepancies for years finally found themselves with both the motivation and the evidence to ask the questions out loud. One older couple who had lived in the development since its very first year admitted they had noticed the landscaping invoices climbing steadily for 3 seasons, running while the actual condition of the common areas seemed to decline, rather than improve, though they had always assumed the numbers were simply the ordinary cost of maintaining a growing community. A younger family recalled being told, when they questioned a particularly steep special assessment 2 years earlier, that the funds were needed for emergency roof repairs on the clubhouse, repairs that, as far as anyone could now confirm, had never actually taken place. Once one thread began to unravel, the rest of the fabric came apart with startling speed, each resident's small suspicion suddenly finding company in a dozen others who had been carrying the same doubts in silence for years. The board meetings that followed grew louder and more chaotic than anything the community had experienced since its founding. Residents who had never before attended a single gathering began showing up in numbers large enough to fill every folding chair and spill out into the hallway, drawn by rumors that had spread quickly through the neighborhood in the days after Ethan's rent increase became public knowledge. Victoria attempted to control the narrative the way she always had, framing the situation as an unfair attack orchestrated by a vindictive former target of legitimate code enforcement. But the tone of the room had shifted in a way she could no longer manage, through sheer force of personality. One resident stood up and asked in front of everyone why the association's landscaping contract had gone to a company owned by Victoria's own brother-in-law 3 years running, despite consistently higher bids from competitors. Another asked why maintenance requests submitted more than a year earlier had never been addressed, despite dues increasing every single cycle. Victoria's answers grew shorter and more defensive with each question, and the applause that had once greeted her every statement had turned, almost overnight, into a low, uncomfortable murmur. Rachel attended one of these meetings at Ethan's request, though not to speak on his behalf directly, since he had made clear from the beginning that he had no interest in personally tearing the association apart. She simply sat near the back, watching, occasionally answering procedural questions when residents asked how they might formally request a financial audit or file a motion for a vote of no confidence. Her presence alone seemed to steady the room in a strange way, giving the frustrated residents a sense that there was, in fact, a correct and orderly process available to them, one that didn't require anyone to shout over anyone else to be heard. By the end of that meeting, enough signatures had been gathered to force a full financial review of the association's records for the previous 3 years, a review that Victoria could not legally block no matter how forcefully she objected. The most crowded meeting in the association's short history took place a month later, held in the very clubhouse whose rent increase had set the whole unraveling into motion. Every seat was filled, extra chairs were brought in from a nearby storage closet, and several residents stood along the back wall simply to be present for what everyone sensed would be a turning point. Rachel presented the findings of the financial review in careful, unemotional detail, walking the room through years of inflated contracts, unexplained expenditures, and dues increases that bore no clear relationship to any actual improvement in the community. She did not editorialize, did not raise her voice, simply laid the numbers out one after another, and let the residents draw their own conclusions, which they did with increasing anger as the presentation continued. Before the personal testimonies began, one board member who had served alongside Victoria for nearly 4 years asked to speak, admitting with visible discomfort that he had signed off on several contracts without reading them closely, trusting Victoria's assurances that everything had already been reviewed by the association's accountant. He explained that questioning her decisions in real time had always felt like more trouble than it was worth, since she tended to treat any pushback in a meeting as a personal betrayal rather than an ordinary function of board governance. Another member admitted she had once raised a concern about a contractor's inflated invoice, only to be quietly excluded from the following 2 committee assignments, a consequence subtle enough that she had never been able to prove it was retaliation, though she had never doubted it for a moment. Their admissions seemed to give the room permission to speak more freely, as though the fear that had kept so many questions unasked for years was finally losing its grip in real time. One by one, residents who had endured years of Victoria's letters and fines and unilateral decisions stood up to share their own experiences with the board's overreach. A woman described being fined for a garden gnome that violated an aesthetic guideline nobody had ever actually voted on. A retired teacher described being threatened with legal action over a wind chime Victoria found personally irritating during her evening walks. A young couple described being denied a request to install solar panels despite the association's own bylaws containing no restriction against them, simply because Victoria had decided, on her own authority, that she didn't care for the way they looked. Each story added weight to the growing sense in the room that the association had stopped serving its residents years ago and had instead become an extension of one woman's need for control. When the vote of no confidence was finally called, it passed by an overwhelming margin, and Victoria was formally removed from her position before the meeting even reached its scheduled end. She left the clubhouse that night without the entourage that had once followed her into every confrontation, walking alone to her car through a parking lot that had, only weeks earlier, been the site of her greatest triumph. Nobody stopped her to argue. Nobody gloated the way she had once gloated on Ethan's porch. And the quiet of that departure seemed to say more than any shouted confrontation could have. The board that formed in the aftermath of her removal was smaller, more cautious, and considerably more interested in transparency than the one it replaced, holding open meetings, publishing financial records without being forced to, and reaching out to residents before making decisions rather than after. In the weeks that followed, several members of the new board approached Ethan directly, asking whether he might be willing to serve as an advisor, or perhaps even take on the presidency himself, given how thoroughly he had exposed the flaws in the previous system. Ethan declined the offer without hesitation, telling them plainly that he had never wanted to run the association and had no interest in becoming the very kind of concentrated authority he had just spent months dismantling. Instead, he offered them 3 conditions in exchange for his continued cooperation as landlord of the clubhouse. The association, he said, existed to serve its residents, not to punish them for failing to conform to one person's preferences. No future board should ever use its authority to settle personal grievances against any individual homeowner, and every decision involving dues, contracts, or enforcement actions needed to be documented and made available to any resident who asked, without exception. The new board agreed to all 3 conditions without argument, grateful simply to have a framework that might prevent the kind of quiet corruption that had nearly bankrupted them. Over the following months, they implemented changes that would have seemed unthinkable under the previous leadership, publishing an itemized budget in a shared newsletter every quarter, opening every contract to competitive bidding rather than quietly favoring whoever happened to know a board member personally, and creating a simple process by which any resident could request an explanation for a fine before it was formally issued rather than after. Attendance at meetings settled into something far less dramatic than the crowded, furious gatherings that had marked the association's collapse, which everyone involved seemed to regard as a considerable improvement. A community that had once organized itself around fear of one woman's temperament slowly reorganized itself around something closer to ordinary cooperation, the kind that rarely made for dramatic viewing but tended to produce neighborhoods people actually wanted to live in. Rachel remained involved for a while longer, helping the new board untangle a handful of lingering contracts that had been signed under questionable circumstances during Victoria's final year in office. One landscaping company, upon learning that its inflated invoices were being reviewed by an actual attorney rather than a rubber stamp board, quietly agreed to renegotiate its rates rather than risk a formal dispute. A security firm that had been billing for patrol services it rarely performed lost its contract entirely once residents compared their invoices against actual footage from doorbell cameras along the main road. None of these resolutions required lawsuits or public confrontations, largely because the mere presence of scrutiny turned out to be enough to correct behavior that had thrived for years under its absence. Ethan stayed out of these proceedings almost entirely, occasionally offering advice when Rachel asked for it, but never inserting himself into decisions that belonged, as he saw it, to people who actually lived within the association's boundaries. Once the new board had been properly elected and the association's finances stabilized under more careful management, Ethan adjusted the clubhouse rent downward to a fair market rate, no longer punitive, simply reasonable, a number that reflected the actual value of the space without threatening to collapse the community's budget. He never framed the adjustment as a gift, never asked for public credit, and most residents only learned about it secondhand, through casual conversation rather than any formal announcement. Victoria, for her part, sold her house within a few months of losing her position, unable or unwilling to remain in a neighborhood where her name had become a cautionary tale rather than a source of pride. Nobody saw her leave, and nobody organized a farewell, which seemed, in its own quiet way, a fitting end to the reign she had once been so certain would last forever. The ranch stood exactly where it had always stood, unchanged by the excavators that had once idled in its driveway, unchanged by the ultimatums and the notices and the crowd of phones that had gathered to watch its supposed destruction. Ethan continued his mornings the same way he always had. Coffee on the porch, the horses grazing in the distance, the workshop humming quietly on weekends as he restored another forgotten piece of machinery back to life. Neighbors who once viewed his property as an inconvenient holdout now pointed to it as something closer to a landmark, a physical reminder of what happened when quiet competence met loud overreach and simply refused to blink. Parents walking past with their children sometimes told the story as though it had happened generations earlier rather than mere months before, embellishing details here and there, though the core of it never needed embellishment to be remarkable. One afternoon, a new resident, who had only recently moved into the development, stopped by the fence line while Ethan was mending a section of rail, curious after hearing several conflicting versions of the story from different neighbors. She asked him directly whether he had ever wanted to make Victoria pay in some more personal way, whether some part of him had wanted to see her humiliated further than the board meetings and the financial exposure already had. Ethan set down his tools and looked out across the pasture for a long moment before answering, the same unhurried calm in his expression that had carried him through every confrontation from the very first morning. "I never wanted to destroy anyone's life," he said. "I just wanted people to live under the same terms they always assumed everyone else should accept." He picked his tools back up, and the conversation ended there, simple and unadorned, the way most true things tend to end when there's nothing left to prove. The new resident lingered by the fence a while longer, watching him work, and eventually asked one more question, curious whether he had ever worried the plan might fail, whether buying the clubhouse out from under an entire homeowners association had felt like a gamble at the time it happened. Ethan considered the question honestly before answering, admitting that Rachel had been more confident in the plan than he had been in the beginning, and that his own certainty had grown only once. Howard Blake sat across from him at that diner and described, in his own words, exactly how tired he had become of being treated as an afterthought by people who assumed his patience would never run out. What had felt like a gamble from the outside, Ethan explained, had actually been closer to arithmetic once all the facts were properly assembled, the sort of outcome that seemed inevitable only after someone finally bothered to check the numbers, instead of relying on assumptions everyone else had simply accepted for years. He didn't consider himself lucky so much as attentive, the kind of attentiveness that came from decades of reading contracts most people skimmed and asking questions most people were too polite to raise. The young woman thanked him and walked back toward her own house, and Ethan returned to the rail he had been mending, unhurried, the horses shifting quietly in the far pasture as the afternoon light stretched long across the grass. It was, in many ways, an ordinary moment on an ordinary piece of land, the kind of afternoon that had repeated itself thousands of times over 4 decades, without anyone outside the family paying much attention to it at all. But the ranch had become something more than a private inheritance now, a story neighbors told each other over fences and driveways, a small local legend about the quiet cost of assuming someone weaker simply because they chose not to shout. The clubhouse continued to host association meetings for years afterward, though the tone of those meetings bore little resemblance to the ones Victoria had once presided over with a gavel and an audience trained to applaud. Residents brought concerns and left with answers rather than fines. Board members explained their decisions instead of simply announcing them. And every so often, when a new arrival tried to push some small, unnecessary rule onto a neighbor who had done nothing wrong, someone in the room would mention, almost in passing, the story of the ranch that refused to fall, and the 24 hours that had, in the end, changed considerably more than anyone standing on that porch could have imagined.